First of all, in Chapter 4, you have information about the powers of the federal government. And among those powers include the United States Constitution's Commerce Clause. One of the things that we know, that we probably know from any class that you might have taken on American government, is that the Constitution creates a government of limited powers. In other words, any power that's not specifically given to the federal government is reserved for the states to exercise. So the federal government is specifically limited in what it may do. If you're looking for a good list of what the powers of the federal government are, then you can just flip to Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, and there you will find a list of powers. That it includes things like printing money and conducting diplomacy with foreign nations. And then you'll also see listed within Article 1, Section 8, the power of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce in and among the states, tribes, and entities within the United States. Interstate means between states, or across several states, or across at least two states. Not to be confused with intra-state, which would be entirely internal to a state. The most important thing you need to know about the Commerce Clause, other than it being a federal power and a conduit through which the government may regulate commerce, is that it has been construed very broadly by the court system, especially since the Great Depression in the late 1930s and early 1940s. You saw a series of Supreme Court cases that reaffirmed that the Commerce Clause power of the federal government is broad, it is strong, it is wide, and it is deep. Probably the biggest example of this is the Wickard v. Filburn case, where a farmer, a rural, small sharecrop farmer, was growing wheat. And they wanted to avoid this situation where you grow too much of a product and it floods the market with that product and reduces prices. So the federal government wanted there to be caps on how much wheat you could grow so the market isn't flooded with wheat, thereby keeping the wheat prices stable and keeping farmers out of poverty. Well, what Farmer Filburn was doing was growing too much wheat. And his argument was, well, the extra that I grow is just for personal consumption. Well, the Supreme Court said that it doesn't matter if it's personal consumption or not, you're still growing in excess of the cap. And they see that as a proper application of the regulatory power of the federal government of interstate commerce, because if every farmer did that, if every farmer that grew wheat also grew a little bit extra for their personal consumption, the cumulative effect of every farmer doing that would still have a significant impact on the national wheat market across all states. So it is a very broad power. We're not just talking about transporting goods in commerce across state lines. We're talking about any act that any business does that could affect other states in any economic way. Okay? Tort liability. Probably one of the biggest areas of exposure, particularly for retail, service and sales, restaurants, storefront shops, is tort liability. Probably the one thing that would really trump this in terms of a corporation's liability or a business's liability would be employee issues, things like civil rights concerns, hiring and firing, and workers' compensation. But tort liability is up there on your top 5 list. It's definitely in the top 3, okay, in terms of areas of liability exposure for a business or a corporation. Why is this such a big area of exposure? Well, there's a lot of things that can be considered torts, which are civil wrongs that one person does to another or a company does to another person. These are not necessarily always considered crimes, okay? Sometimes they are considered both crimes and civil wrongs at the same time. But in this context, we're not talking about criminal behavior. We're just talking about doing bad things to another person. One bad thing you can do to another person is to defame them, which is to say something that's untrue about another person in a way that causes them measurable harm, such as economic harm, like keeping them from getting a job. If you spread a false rumor about a person saying, let's just say, for example, that they were a liar and a cheater, And so nobody wanted to hire a liar and a cheater, and so they ended up going a long time without a job because of those false statements. Then you could probably be found responsible for defamation, and you would owe that person the damages caused by the defamation, maybe a year's salary or something along those lines. Negligence is probably the most commonly litigated area of tort liability. Negligence has several elements. It includes having a duty, having a breach of that duty, the failure to comply with that duty, in other words, and then harm resulting. Okay, so if I have a job as a custodian to put up a wet floor sign when I'm mopping, and I fail to put up the wet floor sign, and someone then walks across that floor, slips and falls and breaks their back, well, I breached my duty of putting up that signage. Therefore, the harm that resulted is on me, or more specifically, on the business that employs me, to compensate that person for their harm. False imprisonment, this happens to be the example that's going to be asked about in the assignment. So learn your elements of false imprisonment from the chapter. False imprisonment, of course, is a civil wrong not because it caused any physical harm to a person, but because it stole part of their life away. It may have stolen several hours of their life away, and that's not right. Okay? So in terms of civil wrongs, especially if it's a brief false imprisonment, maybe not the heaviest damages possible, but some, right? Not nothing. Assault and battery we typically think of as a crime, but also think of it in terms of civil wrong. If you ball up your fist and you make a connection with somebody's nose and you break it, yeah, you probably committed a crime. Okay, and you could be arrested for it and punished by the state. But what happens to that guy's nose that you broke? He's got to go to the doctor and get it fixed. He's got to go get treatment. That might cost anywhere between $500 and several $1,000s. You owe them for that. So you are liable in tort for that damage that you caused to another person. You are civilly liable for that tort. And then, of course, you have others. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, trespass on property. Those are all also examples of tort liability. The possible list of tort liability examples are almost endless. And then finally, criminal acts. I won't spend much time on this. Just make sure that you understand the necessary elements to each crime. In the modern era, almost every crime is defined by some type of statute written by a legislative body. But if you can't ever find a statute on point, then of course the common law would be guiding. Just kind of as an example of this, there didn't used to be statutes on the books about burglary. And so courts, knowing that certainly this was a bad thing to do anyway, even if there wasn't a law on the books, sort of defined it on their own. And it ended up being defined as the improper entering of someone's dwelling place during the nighttime in order to commit a felony therein, such as a theft or a homicide or something along those lines. Obviously, in the modern era, we've stripped the requirements of burglary down to the bare basics. If you go find a burglary statute, even in Oklahoma, and say you typed burglary Oklahoma statute into the Google machine and got a result back, you're going to see that it doesn't have the nighttime requirement, because we acknowledge, of course, today that burglaries could happen at any time of day, not just also at night. So if I ask you a hypothetical that includes anything along those lines, just make sure that you've read your textbook and you understand what the elements of each crime are. All right, until next week, I'll see you later.